We've elected in the city of Seattle a socialist before. What does that tell us about socialism in Seattle?
You know, Seattle has always been a comfortable place for progressive politicians. In fact, in the early 20th century, they said there were 47 states and the Soviet of Washington. So we're familiar with left-wing politics. And we actually have elected a socialist mayor now twice. And that is pretty rare in American cities.
What was different back then when Doc Brown was elected in the 1920s?
Well, Seattle had just come out of a huge labor uprising, the general strike of 1919, where literally the entire working class of the city went on strike. And so Doc Brown promoted himself on really the backs of that activity. But he was a bit of a fair weather socialist. When he actually got elected mayor, he sort of said, just watch what I do, not what I say. And he was progressive, but he wasn't really a socialist.
When we talk about socialism, there are people in certain parts of this country who think that's like associated with violence or public safety or wanting to cut funding to the police department. Was that the case then?
In those days, in the early 20th century, they called Doc Brown an internationalist as well as a socialist. They were thinking of the Russian Revolution, of the Bolsheviks, and they were concerned that a Bolshevik was moving into City Hall. But truthfully, what he really wanted to do was lower transit fares and strengthen public ownership of the power supply. And he did that, but he did switch his opinion rather early in his term and actually became a friend of the corporate interests.
Which is not necessarily the definition of socialism.
No, we talk about politics switching rapidly in Seattle, one-term mayors and so forth. Doc Brown was elected as a socialist, and within 2 years he already was essentially in the pocket of the corporate interests in Seattle.
So this seems like a different type of socialism than what we're talking about now.
Well, Doc Brown was a person who promoted large-scale public ownership, and he actually was successful in helping Seattle achieve that through our Seattle City Light system. He was important in that. But beyond that, he really did not have any socialistic policies. For example, he was very lax with enforcing the laws. He was a person who was accused of corruption. He even turned a blind eye to bootleggers who were bringing liquor illegally into Seattle during Prohibition.
So is there any comparison whatsoever between Doc Brown and Katie Wilson?
Well, Doc Brown thought the word socialist sounded exciting, that it'd get him some votes, and indeed it did. As soon as he got into office, he sort of changed his stripes a bit and became a politician who really was looking for the easy fix and maybe a little bit of graft on the side. I certainly don't think our contemporary politicians would aspire to that, but he was really a socialist in name only. He was unelected after 2 terms. And when he left office, people really were glad to see him go because the incoming mayor was Bertha Knight Landis, our very first woman mayor, and she spent her entire term cleaning up the municipal mess that Doc Brown had created.
I was just going to ask you, was there a legacy there of anything he created under the socialism?
The best thing that Doc Brown did for the region long term was to really push for the Skagit hydroelectric power plant. That really has been a keystone to public electricity and affordable electric prices in Seattle. But beyond that, his legacy was one of a fairly corrupt city hall, individual mayor who spent a lot of time on self-promotion and not as much time on community building. And his legacy was that the city council, led by Bertha Knight Landis, decided that he was the wrong guy for the time. What we needed was a person who had strong ethics, strong moral center, and would help lead to a clean city, politically speaking.
Stories have been written in a national perspective that Seattle has a long history with socialist mayors. This is the second time now that a mayor has been elected that's a self-described socialist. Is there a connection there over the last 100 years for the city of Seattle in terms of the political climate?
Well, socialists are clearly outliers in Seattle politics. There's a long history of socialist mayors, but there have only been 2 in 100 years. But what they both have in common is the issue of livability. Whether they were able to deliver on that promise is a different question, but they both tried to position themselves as someone who could make Seattle affordable. For Doc Brown, it was lowering the price of transit and power. For our current mayor-elect, it's the price of housing and restaurants. So we see a common thread there, but that's a long ways from saying that Seattle as a whole is going in a socialist direction. When Doc Brown left office, the business interests triumphed with a candidate of their own, and that may very well happen in the future in Seattle.